The cabin was filled with thick, choking smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics mixed with melting plastic. Emergency lights flickered like dying stars, casting eerie shadows across the faces of terrified passengers, as Flight 347 from Chicago to Los Angeles shuddered violently through what had started as routine turbulence, but was quickly becoming something far more sinister. In seat 12A, Peter Cetera gripped the worn leather armrests with his weathered hands, his knuckles white with tension, trembling not from his usual fear of flying, but from the growing certainty that something was terribly, catastrophically wrong with this aircraft. The smell was getting stronger now, that unmistakable scent of electrical fire that made his stomach clench with dread. Around him, passengers were beginning to notice too. A businessman in an expensive suit 3 rows ahead kept looking around nervously, his phone pressed to his ear, even though there was no signal at 30,000 feet. A young mother in the window seat across the aisle clutched her sleeping infant closer to her chest, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that only a parent protecting their child could understand. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking from the flight deck. We are currently experiencing some minor technical difficulties with our electrical systems and will be making an unscheduled landing in Denver as a precautionary measure. Please remain calm and seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for early descent. The announcement crackled through static-filled speakers, the captain's voice steady, but unable to mask the underlying tension that every experienced traveler could detect. But Peter's attention wasn't focused on the captain's words, or even his own growing anxiety. Instead, he found himself watching the flight attendant who was moving through the cabin with remarkable composure. Her movements graceful and purposeful, despite the chaos beginning to unfold around them. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with beautiful silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a neat professional bun that somehow managed to stay perfect even as the plane lurched unpredictably through the turbulent air. Her uniform was impeccable, pressed and pristine, but it was her eyes that caught Peter's attention most. They were a warm hazel color, and despite the crisis unfolding around them, they radiated a calm confidence that seemed to emanate from some deep well of inner strength. Her name tag, which he could just make out in the dim emergency lighting, read Margaret Thompson, Senior Flight Attendant. As smoke began seeping more heavily from the overhead compartments above the galley area, panic started to ripple through the passengers like a wave gathering momentum. The businessman who had been on his phone earlier was now shouting at Margaret, his voice shrill with fear and indignation, demanding to know exactly what was happening and why nobody was telling them the truth. His face was red with anger and terror, and spittle flew from his mouth as he gesticulated wildly. "I have a meeting tomorrow morning that could make or break my career," he screamed. "You people need to fix this right now. Do you understand who I am? Do you have any idea what this is costing me?" A young mother with twin toddlers had begun to cry, her tears streaming down her face as she tried to comfort her children who were picking up on her fear and starting to wail. An elderly gentleman in the aisle seat had started hyperventilating, his breathing coming in short, desperate gasps as he fumbled in his jacket pocket for what Peter assumed was heart medication. But Margaret moved through this chaos like poetry in motion, her voice steady and infinitely reassuring as she helped each passenger prepare for emergency landing procedures. She knelt beside the hyperventilating elderly man, speaking to him in low, soothing tones while helping him regulate his breathing. She gently but firmly told the angry businessman that his concerns were noted, but that right now everyone needed to focus on safety procedures. She sat with the crying mother, showing her how to secure her children properly, and reassuring her that everything was going to be fine. Peter watched her work with growing amazement, struck by something profound in her demeanor that went far beyond professional training. There was a grace under pressure that reminded him of the great performers he had known throughout his career, people who could command a stage even when everything was falling apart around them. But this was different. This wasn't performance. This was genuine care, authentic compassion in action. The smoke was getting thicker now, and Peter could see small wisps of it curling out from behind the wall panels near the galley. The acrid smell was becoming more intense, making his eyes water and his throat burn. Other passengers were starting to cough and struggle to breathe, and he could hear someone behind him beginning to panic about the possibility of fire. "Sir, I need you to put your head down between your knees and brace yourself for landing," Margaret said gently to Peter, her hand briefly touching his shoulder in a gesture that was both professional and surprisingly comforting. In that moment, their eyes met directly for the first time, and Peter saw something that took his breath away completely. Behind the professional calm and the practiced smile, there was a depth of sadness, a weight of unspoken stories and buried dreams that seemed to mirror his own recent struggles with purpose and meaning. There was also something else, something that he recognized from looking in his own mirror over the past few months. The quiet desperation of someone who felt invisible, unimportant, forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. Peter had been returning from a series of deeply disappointing meetings in Chicago, the kind of meetings that reminded him just how much the music industry had changed since his heyday. At 69 years old, he found himself increasingly questioning his legacy, his purpose, his place in a world that seemed to worship youth and novelty above all else. The executives he had met with were polite, but dismissive, treating him like a relic from another era, someone whose time had passed long ago. His manager had arranged these meetings ostensibly to discuss a possible comeback album, but Peter could see in their eyes that they were just going through the motions. The music industry had moved on, streaming had changed everything, and artists like him were seen as nostalgia acts at best, completely irrelevant at worst. He had left Chicago feeling more lost and purposeless than he had in years. The plane lurched violently to the right, and suddenly the emergency exit door near Peter's seat began to malfunction, its handle moving, but the door refusing to open properly. Smoke was now billowing more intensely from the galley area, and through the haze, Peter could see small orange flames beginning to lick at the ceiling panels near the back of the aircraft. The acrid smell was becoming overwhelming, and passengers throughout the cabin were starting to cough violently and struggle to breathe the increasingly toxic air. Margaret was at his side instantly, her training and experience taking over completely. "The emergency exit is jammed," she said, her voice still calm but now tinged with genuine urgency. "We need to get you and the other passengers in this section moved to the front of the aircraft immediately. Apunti an." But as she tried to help an elderly woman named Helen from the seat directly behind Peter, the plane pitched forward sharply, throwing everyone off balance. Helen, who appeared to be in her 70s and was traveling alone, fell backward hard, her head striking the metal seat frame with a sickening thud before she collapsed unconscious into her seat, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. Margaret immediately knelt beside her, checking her pulse with practiced efficiency and trying to revive her consciousness. But the smoke was getting thicker by the second, and it was becoming clear that this section of the plane was filling with toxic fumes faster than the rest of the aircraft. Through the haze, Peter could see that the fire was spreading along the ceiling, consuming the plastic panels and insulation with frightening speed. Other passengers in their section were beginning to panic in earnest now, pushing toward the front of the plane in a desperate attempt to escape the smoke and flames. An overweight man in his 50s was having trouble moving quickly and was blocking the aisle. A teenage girl was screaming for her mother, who was several rows ahead. The situation was rapidly deteriorating into chaos. Margaret was trying to help the unconscious woman, while also directing other passengers toward the front of the aircraft and safety. But it was becoming clear that she was going to have to make an impossible choice. She could either help Helen, who was completely helpless, or focus on getting the mobile passengers to safety. But the smoke and fire were advancing too quickly for her to do both effectively. "Go," Peter said firmly, standing up despite the violent turbulence that threatened to throw him off balance. "Help the others get to safety. I'll carry her." Margaret looked at him with surprise and something that might have been gratitude mixed with concern. "Sir, you need to get yourself to safety first. I'm trained for this. I can handle the situation. I'm not leaving without both of you," Peter said with quiet determination. And something in his voice, a tone of absolute resolve that came from decades of performing under pressure, made Margaret pause and really look at him for the first time. She had heard that tone before, the unmistakable sound of someone who had made up their mind completely and would not be deterred no matter what arguments were presented. It was the voice of someone accustomed to taking charge when everything was falling apart. Someone who had learned through experience that sometimes you had to ignore the rules and trust your instincts. Together, they managed to lift the unconscious Helen, who was slight but completely limp, making her difficult to maneuver in the cramped aircraft cabin. Peter, despite his age and the fact that he had never considered himself particularly strong, proved surprisingly capable, adrenaline and determination giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. Margaret guided them through the increasingly smoke-filled cabin toward the front of the plane, her knowledge of the aircraft's layout invaluable in the limited visibility. But as they moved slowly through the chaos, struggling with Helen's unconscious weight while other passengers pushed past them in their desperation to escape, a section of the overhead compartment directly above them suddenly burst into flames. Burning plastic and metal debris began raining down, and the intense heat was immediately overwhelming. Without a moment's hesitation, Margaret threw herself over both Peter and the unconscious Helen, using her own body as a human shield to protect them from the falling, burning debris. Peter felt the heat of her body against his back, felt her arms wrap protectively around both him and Helen, felt her selfless courage in the way she positioned herself between them and the fire, without any thought for her own safety. He could feel her body tense as burning plastic struck her back and shoulders, could hear her sharp intake of breath as the heat penetrated her uniform. But she never wavered, never moved away from her protective position. In that moment, Peter understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just professional duty, but genuine heroism of the most selfless kind. They made it to the front section of the plane just as Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom again, his words now carrying unmistakable urgency. "Flight attendants, prepare for immediate emergency landing. All passengers, brace for impact. We're going down now." The landing was violent and rough, the aircraft hitting the runway at Denver International Airport with bone-jarring force, bouncing twice before finally settling and sliding what felt like an impossibly long distance before coming to a shuddering stop. Emergency crews were waiting on the runway, their red and white vehicles already in motion before the plane had completely stopped moving. Passengers were evacuated quickly through emergency slides, the organized chaos of a well-rehearsed emergency response taking over. Peter found himself sitting on the cold tarmac, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled of diesel fuel and industrial cleaner, watching Margaret coordinate with the emergency responders with the same calm efficiency she had shown throughout the entire crisis. Helen, the unconscious woman they had helped rescue, was taken immediately to the hospital but was expected to make a full recovery according to the paramedics. Her head injury looked worse than it was, they assured everyone, and she was already beginning to regain consciousness as they loaded her into the ambulance. As the immediate chaos began to settle and passengers were being transported to the terminal to arrange alternate flights and deal with their luggage, Peter realized he hadn't had a proper chance to thank Margaret for what she had done. The enormity of her selfless action was beginning to sink in. She had literally risked her life to protect two strangers, and she had done it without hesitation or expectation of recognition. He found her sitting alone near one of the emergency vehicles, finally allowing herself a moment to process what had happened. Her perfect flight attendant composure had given way to quiet exhaustion, and Peter could see her hands shaking slightly as she held a cup of coffee that someone had given her. Her uniform was singed and stained with smoke, and there were small burns visible on her arms where debris had struck her. "Excuse me," Peter said softly, approaching her carefully so as not to startle her. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did back there. What you did, you saved our lives. You saved Helen's life and mine, and you could have been killed doing it." Margaret looked up at him with tired eyes and managed a small, weary smile. "Just doing my job, sir. That's what we're trained for." "No," Peter said emphatically, sitting down beside her on the metal bumper of the emergency vehicle. "That was far beyond duty or training. You could have helped evacuate the mobile passengers and left us behind. It would have been the logical choice, the safe choice. Why didn't you?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles and the bustling activity of the rescue operation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and Peter had to lean closer to hear her over the noise of the airport operations. 23 years I've been flying," she finally said, her words coming slowly as if she was working through her thoughts as she spoke. 23 years of serving coffee and peanuts, demonstrating safety procedures that passengers ignore, dealing with difficult customers who treat me like I'm invisible. People see the uniform and the smile and think they know who I am, think they know what I'm worth. She paused, taking a sip of her coffee with hands that were still trembling slightly. "But today I felt like I actually mattered. Like I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. Like what I did could make a real difference in someone's life." "You've been making a difference for 23 years, Peter said gently, struck by the sadness in her voice. "Every person you've helped, every crisis you've handled with that incredible grace and competence. That all mattered. Every passenger who felt safer because of your presence. Every family you've helped during medical emergencies. Every time you've shown kindness to someone having the worst day of their life. That's all real difference." Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only a bone-deep weariness that Peter recognized from his own recent struggles with relevance and purpose. "Grace, you should see me at home, Mr. Cetra? Peter Cetra. Mr. Cetra, you should see me at home, trying to stretch a flight attendant's salary to cover my mother's Alzheimer's care, working extra shifts just to make ends meet, wondering if I'll have enough saved for my own retirement. You should see me lying awake at night wondering what happened to all the dreams I used to have, wondering if this is all there is to my life. There's not much grace in any of that." Peter studied her face in the dim light from the emergency vehicles, seeing in her expression something that resonated deeply with his own recent feelings of being forgotten and irrelevant. "What did you want to be?" he asked quietly. "Before you became a flight attendant, what was your dream?" The question seemed to catch Margaret completely off guard. She stared at him for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe he had asked. As if it had been so long since anyone had shown interest in her as a person rather than just a service provider, that she had almost forgotten she had once had dreams and ambitions beyond her uniform. She was quiet for so long that Peter thought she might not answer, might deflect the question or change the subject the way people often did when asked about abandoned dreams. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and there was a wistfulness in her tone that spoke of old hopes, carefully buried but never quite forgotten. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said, the words coming out slowly as if she was afraid to give them voice. "Elementary school, 2nd or 3rd grade, that age when kids are still excited about learning, when they still believe that anything is possible. I used to volunteer at the children's hospital near my college, reading stories to the kids who were stuck there for long treatments, helping them with their homework when they felt up to it." Her eyes took on a distant quality as she remembered, and for the first time since Peter had met her, she looked truly relaxed, as if talking about this old dream was allowing her to access a part of herself she had locked away long ago. "I had this crazy idea that I could make a real difference in their lives, help them see that learning could be magical, that books could take you anywhere you wanted to go. I loved watching their faces light up when they finally understood a difficult concept, or when they discovered a new book that they couldn't put down. I thought I could spend my life doing that, helping children fall in love with learning. She shook her head ruefully, the distant look fading as reality reasserted itself. But my father got sick during my senior year of college. Cancer. The treatments were expensive, and even with insurance, the medical bills were crushing our family. The airlines were hiring. The pay was decent compared to what a new teacher would make, and I told myself it would just be temporary, just until we got back on our feet financially. "What happened?" Peter asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Life happened," Margaret said with a bitter smile. "Dad died 6 months after I started flying, but by then we were drowning in medical debt. Mom needed help with the bills, with the house, with everything. By the time I could have gone back to school to finish my education degree, I was already in my 30s, and it seemed too late to start over. The kids I had dreamed of teaching were getting older, and I was getting older, and the dream just faded away." She gestured vaguely at her uniform, at the chaos of the emergency scene around them. And here I am, 23 years later, still serving coffee at 30,000 feet, still trying to convince myself that this matters, that I'm making some kind of difference in the world. Peter felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went beyond sympathy to something deeper and more personal. Here was a woman who had spent more than 2 decades serving others, who had literally risked her life to save strangers just hours ago, and she thought her life didn't matter. She thought her dreams were dead because she had chosen love and responsibility over personal ambition. It reminded him of his own recent struggles with relevance and purpose. Since his peak years with Chicago and as a solo artist, he had often felt like the world had moved on without him, that his music and his voice no longer mattered in a culture obsessed with youth and novelty. But looking at Margaret, seeing her selfless heroism and her deep well of compassion, he began to understand something important about the nature of impact and significance. "Margaret," he said carefully, leaning forward so he could look directly into her eyes, "what if I told you it's not too late? What if I told you that everything you've been doing for the past 23 years has been preparing you for something even more meaningful than what you originally dreamed?" She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been hope, though it was tempered by years of disappointment and resignation. "What do you mean? I'm 51 years old, Mr. Cetra. I don't have an education degree, I don't have teaching certification, and I certainly don't have the money to go back to school and start over." Peter reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found a number he hadn't called in several months. "This is Dr. Sarah Martinez," he said, showing Margaret the contact information. "She runs a program called Healing Through Learning that brings music, arts, and educational programming to children's hospitals across the country. They're always looking for volunteers, especially people with experience working with children and handling crisis situations." Margaret stared at the phone screen as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. "I don't understand. Why are you showing me this? You don't even know me. Because today you showed me what real heroism looks like," Peter said earnestly. "Not the kind that gets written about in newspapers or remembered in songs, but the everyday heroism of someone who chooses to protect others even when it costs them everything. That's exactly the kind of person children need to learn from, especially children who are facing their own crises and challenges." Without waiting for her response, Peter dialed the number. It rang twice before a warm, professional voice answered. "Dr. Martinez, Healing Through Learning Program." "Sarah, this is Peter Cetra. I know it's been a while since we've spoken, but I'm calling because I just met someone truly extraordinary, and I think you need to meet her as soon as possible." As Peter briefly explained the situation to Dr. Martinez, describing the plane emergency and Margaret's heroic actions, Margaret sat in stunned silence. She couldn't believe that this stranger, this man whose life she had helped save just hours ago, was taking such an active interest in her abandoned dreams and forgotten ambitions. Dr. Martinez would like to speak with you, Peter said, holding out the phone to Margaret. She has a new program starting next month that trains volunteers to work with hospitalized children. The training is completely free, and they work around your existing schedule. She says they especially need people with your kind of background and experience. Margaret took the phone with trembling hands, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and terror. Hello, this is Margaret Thompson. For the next 15 minutes, Peter watched as Margaret's face underwent a complete transformation. The exhaustion and resignation that had marked her features gave way to something he hadn't seen before. Genuine excitement, hope, the light of possibility shining in her eyes for the first time since he had met her. Dr. Martinez explained that the Healing Through Learning program was specifically designed for people like Margaret, individuals with life experience and compassion who wanted to make a difference in children's lives but didn't necessarily have traditional educational backgrounds. The program provided comprehensive training in child psychology, medical environments, and educational techniques, all while allowing volunteers to maintain their regular employment. She wants me to come in for an interview next week, Margaret said in disbelief when she finally hung up the phone. She said they especially need people with experience in crisis management and working with diverse groups of people under pressure. She said that what I did today, the way I handled the emergency while still caring for individual passengers, demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking and compassion they're looking for. Margaret's voice broke slightly as she continued. She said it sounds like I've been preparing for this work my whole life without even knowing it. She said that sometimes the most effective teachers are people who have lived through challenges themselves, who understand what it means to be afraid or uncertain or to feel like giving up. Peter smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since his disappointing meetings in Chicago, he felt like he had accomplished something truly meaningful, something that would have a lasting impact beyond his own career concerns. Maybe you have been preparing for this your whole life, he said gently. Maybe every difficult passenger you've dealt with patiently, every medical emergency you've handled calmly, every time you've shown kindness to someone who was having the worst day of their life. Maybe all of that was training for something bigger and more important than you realized. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last of the emergency vehicles pack up their equipment and the final passengers being transported to the terminal. The immediate crisis was over, the danger had passed, and life was slowly returning to normal. But for both Peter and Margaret, something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of themselves and their purpose in the world. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said eventually, studying Peter's face more carefully in the better lighting as dawn began to break over the Denver airport. "You seem very familiar to me, but I can't quite place you. Are you someone I should recognize?" Peter chuckled, suddenly feeling self-conscious about his celebrity status in a way he hadn't for years. "I used to make music, a long time ago. Nothing you'd probably remember unless you're a fan of very old songs." But Margaret was looking at him more intently now, her brow furrowed in concentration as recognition slowly dawned. "Wait just a minute. You're Peter Cetera, aren't you? From the band, Chicago." Peter nodded, feeling that familiar mixture of pride and awkwardness that came with being recognized after all these years. That was a lifetime ago, it seems. "Are you kidding me?" Margaret's eyes were wide with genuine amazement and something approaching awe. "My mother and I used to play your songs constantly when I was growing up. Hard to say I'm sorry. You're the inspiration, glory of love. Those songs were the soundtrack to my entire adolescence and young adulthood." She was quiet for a moment, and then she started to laugh. Not the bitter, exhausted laugh from earlier, but something genuine and joyful and full of wonder. "This is absolutely incredible. Do you know how many times I listened to Hard Habit to Break during my divorce? How many times Glory of Love played at weddings where I was working? How many times your voice got me through difficult shifts or lonely nights? Margaret shook her head in amazement. Your music has been the soundtrack to my entire adult life, providing comfort during the hardest times and joy during the best times. And here you are, sitting on a curb with me at 4 in the morning after we survived a plane fire together. If someone had told me yesterday that this would happen, I would have thought they were completely insane. Peter felt his throat tighten with emotion. For months, he had been questioning whether his music had really mattered in the long run, whether he had made any lasting impact on the world beyond brief entertainment. The music industry's dismissive attitude toward his legacy had left him feeling irrelevant and forgotten, like a relic from an era that no longer mattered to anyone. And here was this remarkable woman, this genuine hero who had risked her life to save strangers, telling him that his songs had been a source of comfort and strength during the most difficult moments of her life. It was exactly the kind of validation he had been seeking without even realizing it. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice thick with feeling, "I want you to know something important. Today you reminded me why I started making music in the first place. It was never really about fame or charts or recognition from the industry. It was about connection, about reaching people who needed to know they weren't alone in their struggles. You've been doing that same work your entire career, even if no one ever wrote a song about it or gave you an award for it." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though Peter could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand. "Every passenger you've comforted during turbulence, every family you've helped during a medical emergency, every time you've shown patience and kindness to someone who was being difficult because they were afraid or stressed, that's music, Margaret. That's art in its purest form. That's the most important work any of us can do, creating moments of beauty and comfort and human connection in a world that can be harsh and frightening." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and Peter could see that she was beginning to view her life and work from a completely different perspective. "I never thought of it that way. I always felt like I was just going through the motions, just doing what I had to do to pay the bills." "Well, maybe it's time you started seeing yourself the way others see you," Peter said firmly. "The way I saw you today, the way Dr. Martinez heard you in your voice, the way those children you're going to work with are going to see you. You're not just a flight attendant, Margaret. You're a healer, a teacher, a protector. You always have been." Peter stood up and offered her his hand. "Come on, let's get you to the terminal so you can call your mother and let her know you're safe." "And Margaret?" "Yes?" "Promise me you'll call Dr. Martinez back and set up that interview. Those children are going to be incredibly lucky to have you in their lives." As they walked toward the terminal building, the sun was beginning to rise over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Peter found himself thinking about the strange ways that life could surprise you, how a crisis that could have ended in tragedy had instead become a moment of profound connection and transformation for both of them. 6 months later, Peter received a thick envelope at his home in Malibu. Inside was a collection of photographs showing Margaret in various hospital settings, surrounded by children who were clearly hanging on her every word. In one photo, she was reading from a colorful picture book to a group of young patients in a pediatric ward. In another, she was helping a teenage boy with his homework while he received chemotherapy. In a third, she was leading a group of children in what appeared to be a music therapy session. Along with the photographs was a handwritten letter on hospital letterhead. "Dear Peter, I wanted you to know that I just completed my 6th month as a volunteer coordinator with Dr. Martinez's Healing Through Learning program, and it has been the most fulfilling period of my entire life. You were absolutely right when you said that everything I had done before was preparation for this work. Every skill I learned as a flight attendant, every crisis I navigated, every difficult person I dealt with patiently, it all prepared me for this calling. The airline has been incredibly supportive, allowing me to adjust my schedule so that I can spend 3 days a week working with the children. I'm also enrolled in online courses through the University of Colorado, working toward my teaching certification. Doctor, Martinez has encouraged me to consider eventually transitioning to full-time work with the program. And for the first time in decades, I can actually envision a future that excites me. Last week, a 7-year-old girl named Emma told me that my stories were better medicine than anything the doctors had given her. She's fighting leukemia with more courage than most adults could manage. But when I read to her, she lights up like the sun. Yesterday, she asked if I was a real teacher. And when I said yes, she said she wanted to be just like me when she grew up. I think about that night at the Denver airport often. I think about how you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. How you refused to let me dismiss my dreams as impossible. You didn't just help save my life that night. You helped me remember that I had a life worth saving, a future worth working toward. I hope you know that your music continues to touch lives in ways you probably never imagined. But more than that, I hope you know that your kindness, your willingness to see the best in a stranger during her darkest moment, changed everything for me, and, through me, for dozens of children who needed someone to believe in them. Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. With endless gratitude and love, Margaret Thompson, P.S. I play You're the inspiration for the children sometimes during our music therapy sessions. They love it, and it always reminds me of that night when you inspired me to believe in myself again. I tell them that the man who wrote that song taught me that we all have the power to inspire others, no matter what our job title might be. Peter set the letter down on his kitchen table and walked out to his deck overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink that reminded him of that morning in Denver when he and Margaret had watched the sunrise together after surviving the fire. He thought about Margaret, probably reading bedtime stories to sick children at that very moment. He thought about the ripple effect of kindness, how one moment of truly seeing another person could change the trajectory of an entire life. He thought about the children whose lives Margaret was touching, who would grow up remembering the kind woman who made them feel special and important during the scariest time of their young lives. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his manager, calling about a possible comeback tour, a new album, another chance to return to the spotlight and reclaim some of his former glory. Peter listened politely to the pitch. Sold-out venues filled with nostalgic baby boomers, corporate sponsorships, merchandise deals, the whole machinery of celebrity that he had once thrived on. But as his manager talked, Peter found himself thinking about something entirely different. Actually, he said, cutting his manager off mid-sentence, I have a different idea. What would you think about organizing some benefit concerts for children's hospitals? I know some people who are doing absolutely incredible work with young patients, and I think it's time I used whatever platform I still have to shine a light on real heroes. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Benefit concerts? Peter? Those don't make money. Your fans want to hear the hits, not watch you give away your earnings to charity. Maybe it's time I stopped worrying so much about money and started thinking about meaning, Peter replied. I've spent the last few months feeling sorry for myself because the industry doesn't value what I do anymore. But maybe the industry isn't where the real value lies. As he hung up the phone, Peter smiled, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Sometimes the most important performances weren't on stage at all. Sometimes they happened at 4 in the morning on an airport tarmac, when one person chose to see the extraordinary potential in someone else's seemingly ordinary life. The next week, Peter called Dr. Martinez and arranged to visit Margaret's program at Children's Hospital, Colorado. When he walked into the pediatric ward and saw Margaret in her element, confident, radiant, completely in command of her gifts and purpose, he knew that the real hero of their story had never been him at all. Margaret looked up from the circle of children she was reading to and caught sight of Peter in the doorway. Her face broke into the most beautiful smile he had ever seen. an expression of pure joy and gratitude that lit up the entire room. She mouthed 2 words silently. "Thank you." But Peter just shook his head and mouthed back, "Thank you." Because sometimes being saved has nothing to do with fire, or smoke, or emergency landings. Sometimes being saved means having someone believe in you when you've forgotten how to believe in yourself. And sometimes the person who saves you is the same person whose life you thought you were saving, creating a circle of healing and purpose that extends far beyond anything either of you could have imagined. In the months that followed, Peter began making regular visits to children's hospitals, not as a celebrity making token appearances, but as Margaret's partner in bringing joy, music, and hope to young patients facing their own battles. He watched her work with growing awe, seeing how she connected with each child individually, how she made them feel seen and valued and loved during the most difficult time of their lives. One day, as they were leaving after a particularly moving session with a group of teenagers fighting various forms of cancer, Peter turned to Margaret and said, "You know, I've performed for millions of people over the years, in stadiums and arenas around the world. But I've never felt more like I was making real music than I do when I'm here with you and these kids." Margaret linked her arm through his as they walked toward the parking garage, her face glowing with the satisfaction that comes from meaningful work. "It's funny, isn't it? I've never felt more like a teacher than I do now. And this isn't anything like the classroom I imagined when I was 22. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the universe had a different plan for both of us." "Do you ever regret it?" Peter asked as they reached her car. "The years you spent thinking your dreams were over, feeling like your life didn't matter?" Margaret considered the question carefully as she unlocked her car door. "I used to. For a long time, I was angry about the path my life had taken, bitter about the dreams I'd had to give up. But now I think maybe those years weren't lost time at all. Maybe they were preparation time." She paused, looking back at the hospital where soft lights glowed in the windows of the pediatric ward. "Maybe I needed to learn how to serve people with grace, how to stay calm in crisis situations, how to see past surface appearances to what people really need. Maybe I needed to experience disappointment and setback, and the feeling of being invisible so I could help these children understand that difficult times don't mean the end of hope." Peter nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I spent months before that flight thinking my best days were behind me, that my music didn't matter anymore, that the world had moved on without me. But watching you work, seeing the difference you make in these children's lives, it's reminded me that the most important songs aren't always the ones that play on the radio." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "I mean that every story you read to a scared child, every moment of comfort you provide to a worried parent, every time you help a young patient believe that they're going to be okay, that's music too. That's the kind of song that really changes lives, that echoes in people's hearts long after the melody fades." As they said goodbye that evening, Peter realized that Margaret had taught him something profound about the nature of heroism and significance. True heroism wasn't about dramatic gestures or public recognition. It was about showing up, day after day, for people who needed you. It was about seeing potential where others saw only problems. It was about believing in the power of small acts of kindness to create ripples that could change the world. 6 months later, Peter released his first album in over 5 years. It was called Unsung Heroes, and every song was inspired by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Teachers and nurses and flight attendants and social workers, and all the other people who held the world together through their quiet acts of service and compassion. The title track was about a flight attendant who chose to shield strangers from fire, who spent her free time reading to sick children, who proved that real strength was quiet and constant and revolutionary. But the song that meant the most to Peter was the final track on the album, a gentle ballad called The Teacher. It was Margaret's story, but it was also the story of everyone who had ever put their dreams on hold to take care of others, who had ever felt invisible or unimportant, who had ever needed someone to remind them that it was never too late to become who they were meant to be. The album went gold, but Peter's favorite review came from a 9-year-old boy named David, who was being treated for a rare blood disorder at Children's Hospital, Colorado. David sent him a crayon drawing of an airplane with 2 stick figures standing outside it, one holding a microphone, one holding a book. At the bottom, in shaky child handwriting, it said, "Thank you for the music. Thank you for bringing Miss Margaret to us. You are both heroes." Peter framed the drawing and hung it in his home studio, where it served as a daily reminder that sometimes the most important performances happened not on stage, but in hospital rooms and on airplane tarmacs, and in any place where one person chose to see the light in another person's soul and help them remember their own worth and potential. And every time he looked at that drawing, Peter thought about Margaret, who was probably at that very moment reading stories to children who needed to know they were not alone, who were learning that even in the darkest times, there were still people who would fight to keep them safe, who would see their potential when they couldn't see it themselves. The flight that brought them together had been an emergency, a crisis that could have ended in tragedy. But Peter came to understand that the real miracle wasn't that they survived the fire. The real miracle was that they found each other at exactly the moment when they both needed to remember that their lives mattered, that their gifts were needed, that it was never too late to answer the call to become who they were truly meant to be. In a world that often felt harsh and disconnected, their story became a reminder that heroes come in all forms, often wearing uniforms we barely notice, serving others without recognition or fanfare. Sometimes the person who saves you is the same person whose life you help transform. Sometimes the most important music isn't played on instruments at all, but in the quiet symphony of one human being choosing to see the extraordinary in another, choosing to believe in possibilities when hope seems lost, choosing to kindle light in the darkness of another's despair. Their stories spread, as such stories do, touching other lives and inspiring other acts of kindness and recognition. Margaret became a sought-after speaker at healthcare conferences, sharing her insights about the importance of seeing patients as whole human beings rather than just medical cases. Peter used his platform to highlight the work of healthcare heroes and unsung servants in communities across the country. But the real impact of their meeting continued to ripple outward through the lives of the children they served together, young people who learned from their example that true heroism lay not in grand gestures, but in the daily choice to care for others, to see potential where others saw only problems, to believe that every life had value and meaning, and the possibility for transformation. This story reminds us that heroes come in all forms, often wearing uniforms we barely notice, serving others without recognition or fanfare. Sometimes the person who saves you is the same person whose life you help transform. Sometimes the most important music isn't played on instruments at all, but in the quiet symphony of one human being choosing to see the extraordinary in another. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Share in the comments below about a time when someone saw potential in you that you couldn't see in yourself, or when you were able to help someone else recognize their own worth and possibilities. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Remember, we all have the power to be heroes in someone else's story. Sometimes all it takes is choosing to really see the person in front of us and believing in their potential for greatness.